The restaurant smelled like aged whiskey and expensive cologne, a combination I'd learned to associate with men who tipped poorly and touched too casually. The ambient lighting cast everything in a warm, golden glow that made even the most exhausted diners look elegant. My feet ached in my black flats, the same pair I'd been wearing for 6 months because new ones weren't in the budget. Not when rent was 3 weeks overdue and the electricity company had sent its final notice. I moved between tables like a shadow, balancing plates and forcing smiles that never quite reached my eyes. The other servers had long since stopped trying to include me in their gossip. I was the quiet one, the one who kept her head down and never complained, even when Marco, the bartender, made comments about my figure or when customers snapped their fingers at me like I was furniture. "Table 7 needs water," Jennifer called from the service station, not bothering to look up from her phone. She was the kind of woman who'd married well once and couldn't quite accept that divorce had returned her to the working class. Now she just wore designer knockoffs and treated the younger servers like rivals. I grabbed the pitcher and made my way to table 7, my mind already running through the calculations I did every night. If I could pick up the Sunday brunch shift, maybe I could cover next month's rent. If the bus fare didn't increase again, I could save enough for winter boots before the snow came. If my entire life had become a series of impossible ifs. The dining room was moderately busy, as it usually was on Thursday evenings. Just the regular business crowd finishing their second bottles of wine, a few couples celebrating anniversaries they'd probably forget by morning, and table 7. I'd noticed them when they arrived. Impossible not to. 4 people in clothing that probably cost more than 6 months of my salary, occupying a prime table near the windows. They didn't quite belong here, not in this upscale but ultimately forgettable establishment where the decor tried too hard and the wine list was impressive only to people who didn't know better. But it was the man who made my hands tremble slightly as I approached. He sat with his back to the wall. I noticed that immediately the way his dark eyes scanned the room constantly, cataloging exits and potential threats. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him like it had been custom-made in Milan, and even sitting down, I could tell he commanded every space he occupied. His hair was dark and precisely styled, touched with distinguished silver at the temples, and there was something about the way he held himself that radiated danger and power in equal measure. The tattoos that crept up from his collar and disappeared beneath his cuffs only reinforced the impression of controlled violence. The other 3 people fell silent as I approached, their conversation dying mid-sentence. One of them, a blonde woman in a white blazer with a gaze that could cut glass, actually leaned back in her seat, watching me with the kind of assessment that made my skin crawl. A heavy-set man with cold eyes subtly adjusted his jacket, and I tried not to think about what might be concealed there. The 4th person, an elegant Asian woman in her 60s, simply smiled at me with the kind of warmth that felt desperately out of place at this table. "Water refills?" My voice came out smaller than I intended, and I hated myself for it. I'd learned long ago that showing weakness only invited exploitation, but something about these people about him made my usual armor feel paper-thin. The man in charcoal, the one who was clearly in charge, looked up at me, and I felt the full weight of his attention like a physical force. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, and they studied me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. Not the way Marco looked at me with obvious hunger. This was different, calculating, dangerous, dismissive. "Yes, thank you," he said, his voice carrying an accent I couldn't quite place. Irish, maybe, with American polish layered over it. His English was perfect, cultured, but there was something underneath it, something that spoke of streets harder than the ones I knew. I poured the water with shaking hands, trying not to spill. The blonde woman watched me like I might contaminate the table. The heavy-set man seemed bored, checking his phone. The older Asian woman continued to smile, but there was something sad in her eyes now, something distant. "Will there be anything else?" I asked, already backing away, wanting nothing more than to return to the safety of the service station where Jennifer was still scrolling through social media. Actually, the man's phone buzzed, and he held up one finger, gesturing for me to wait. I froze, pitcher still in hand, as he answered in rapid Korean. The language flowed from him naturally, businesslike and efficient, and something in my chest tightened painfully. I shouldn't have understood it. I shouldn't have been able to follow the conversation. But I did. "엄마, 일하고 있다고 했잖아요," he said, and there was something almost exasperated in his voice, so at odds with the cold menace that surrounded him. "Mom, I told you I'm working. 아니요, 오늘 저녁 식사 못 가요. 네, 잡채 만든 거 알아요. 엄마, 제발." No, I can't come for dinner tonight. Yes, I know you made japchae. Mom, please. The words transported me back 15 years to a tiny kitchen that always smelled like sesame oil and garlic, where my mother hummed while she chopped vegetables and my father practiced his broken English at the table. Before the accident, before the foster homes, before I learned that the past was something to be buried deep where no one could use it against you. The man on the phone sighed, running his hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration that was so familiar, so human, that I almost forgot to be afraid. Arasoyo, na중에 들을게요. 하지만 안 기다리세요. 늦을 수도 있어요. Fine, I'll try to stop by later, but don't wait up. I might be late. He switched back to English, speaking to the heavy-set man about some shipment that needed to be rerouted through a different port, and I stood there like an idiot, rooted to the spot, memories flooding through me with the force of a tsunami. Miss? The blonde woman's voice was sharp, annoyed. He asked you a question. I blinked, realizing that the dark-haired man was staring at me again. Those black eyes narrowed slightly, studying me with new interest. I'm sorry, what? I asked if the kitchen could prepare something without shellfish. He repeated slowly, deliberately. And there was something new in his voice now, curiosity, calculation. My mother has a severe allergy. She can't have any cross-contamination. The words were out before I could stop them, tumbling from my lips in Korean before my brain could catch up to my mouth. 물론이죠, 할머니. 새우 없는 요리 많아요. 주방에 특별히 요청할게요. 알레르기 있으시면 조심해야죠. Of course, grandmother. We have many dishes without shrimp. I'll make a special request to the kitchen. Allergies must be taken seriously. The silence that fell over the table was absolute. The blonde woman's mouth fell open slightly. The heavy-set man's hand moved inside his jacket, his entire body tensing. The older woman's eyes widened, filling with tears that she didn't try to hide. But it was the dark-haired man's reaction that terrified me most. He went utterly still, his entire body coiling like a predator about to strike. Those dark eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made it difficult to breathe, and I watched as shock gave way to something else, something calculating and far more dangerous. You speak Korean. It wasn't a question. His voice had gone soft, deadly soft, and I realized with growing horror that I'd made a terrible, catastrophic mistake. My throat closed up. The pitcher slipped from my nerveless fingers, and I watched as if in slow motion as it shattered against the marble floor, water and broken glass spreading across the polished stone. I'm so sorry, I gasped, dropping to my knees immediately, my hands shaking as I tried to gather the pieces. This was it. Robert would fire me. I couldn't afford to lose this job. I couldn't afford to lose anything. Leave it. The command was quiet, but absolute. I looked up to find the dark-haired man standing over me, having moved with a speed and silence that should have been impossible for someone his size. He extended a hand, and I stared at it like it might be a trap, which it probably was. His hands were large, I noticed, with long fingers and prominent veins. The kind of hands that had built things, broken things. The watch on his wrist was a Patek Philippe that probably cost more than everything I owned combined. His knuckles bore faded scars that told stories I didn't want to know. I said, leave it, he repeated, his accent thicker now, and there was something in his voice that made obedience instinctive. I took his hand, warm, calloused, despite the expensive suit, strong, and let him pull me to my feet. He didn't let go immediately, and I found myself standing far too close to him, close enough to smell his cologne, something expensive and dark with notes of cedar and tobacco, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. Where did you learn to speak Korean? He asked, still holding my hand, his thumb pressed against my pulse point in a way that was definitely not accidental. He would feel how fast my heart was racing. He would know I was terrified. My mother, I stammered, unable to think straight with him this close, with those eyes boring into mine like he could read every secret I'd ever kept. She was from Seoul. She died when I was 19. It was the truth, or part of it, the sanitized version I gave to the rare person who asked. I didn't mention the car accident that killed both my parents when I was a teenager. Didn't mention the 2 years in foster care before I aged out. Didn't mention the community college classes I'd abandoned when the money ran out. Didn't mention the string of bad choices and worse luck that had led me here, to this moment, with my hand in the grip of a man who was clearly dangerous in ways I couldn't begin to understand. Soul, he repeated, and something flickered across his face. Recognition, calculation, and beneath it all, something that looked almost like satisfaction. He turned to the older woman, speaking in rapid Korean. Ama, 이여자봐요. 서울 사람이에요. Mom, look at this woman. She's from Seoul. The older woman stood slowly, her eyes never leaving my face. She approached with trembling steps, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. 어디 출신이에요? Where from in Seoul? Gangnam, I whispered, the neighborhood name feeling foreign on my tongue after so many years of hiding it. Gangnam. The woman's face crumpled, and she reached out to touch my cheek with a gentleness that made my eyes burn. Mi-sunny, she whispered, a name I hadn't heard in years. Mi-sun. That's not, I started to say, but the dark-haired man's grip on my hand tightened, not painfully, but enough to silence me. What's your name? He asked quietly, still in Korean, his eyes never leaving mine. Sean, I managed. Sean Casey. Your real name, he pressed, and there was steel beneath the softness now. I hadn't said it aloud in almost a decade, hadn't let myself think it, but something about the way his mother was looking at me, the tears tracking through her expensive makeup, the recognition in her eyes. Han So-yeon, I whispered, and felt something inside me crack open. The man smiled then, but it wasn't a comforting expression. It was the smile of someone who'd just found a missing piece to a puzzle he'd been working on for a very long time. Seo-yeon, he repeated, testing the name. My name is Byron Maloney, and I think you and I need to have a very long conversation about your mother. He finally released my hand, only to reach into his jacket and pull out a business card. Call me tomorrow, or I'll come find you. And trust me, his smile sharpened. You'd prefer to call. He placed the card in my hand, and beneath his contact information, he'd written something in Korean. 우리 엄마의 가장 친한 친구의 딸, the daughter of my mother's best friend. I stood frozen as they left, the elegant older woman looking back at me with an expression of desperate hope, Byron Maloney's dark eyes promising that this was far from over. Jennifer appeared at my elbow with a broom. Girl, what the hell was that about? Do you know who that was? That was Byron Maloney. His family basically owns half the import businesses on the East Coast. People say, she lowered her voice conspiratorially, people say he's connected. Like, connected. But I wasn't listening. I was staring at the business card in my hand, at the Korean characters that seemed to burn my palm, and thinking about the way Charvalita Lankford had touched my face and whispered my mother's name like a prayer. I'd spent 10 years making myself invisible, and in less than 5 minutes, I'd been seen by exactly the wrong people. Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. I didn't call. For 3 days, Byron Maloney's business card sat on my nightstand like a loaded gun, his Korean message burning holes through the cheap particle board. I told myself I'd lost it, thrown it away, forgotten about it. But every morning I woke up and there it was, white cardstock gleaming in the pre-dawn darkness, mocking my cowardice. I spent those 3 days researching him obsessively on the library computers, since my phone's data plan had expired 2 months ago. Byron Maloney, 38, CEO of Maloney Import-Export Solutions. The company website was sleek and professional, all smiling diverse employees and testimonials about efficient logistics, but 10 minutes of digging brought up different results. A Reddit thread speculating about his family's ties to Irish organized crime. A local news article about a warehouse fire that destroyed evidence in a federal investigation. Court documents showing a pattern of charges filed and mysteriously dropped. Nothing concrete, nothing proven, but enough smoke to guarantee fire. I considered running. I had $247 in my checking account and a bus ticket to Cleveland cost $89. I could disappear, change my name again, find another restaurant in another city where rich men didn't speak Korean to their mothers, and I could go back to being invisible. I'd done it before when I aged out of foster care. I could do it again. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way Charvalita had touched my face and whispered my mother's name. Maybe it was the certainty that men like Byron Maloney didn't make polite requests, they gave orders, and running would only delay the inevitable. Maybe I was just tired of running. The knock came at 5:47 a.m. on the 4th day. 3 sharp raps that jerked me awake from dreams of my mother's kitchen. I knew before I opened the door that my time was up. 2 men stood in the dingy hallway, both wearing dark suits that probably cost more than my entire year's rent. The first was built like a linebacker, all shoulders and controlled menace, with a neck that disappeared into his collar and eyes that cataloged every detail of my studio apartment in a single sweep. The second was leaner, almost scholarly-looking, with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of calm expression that suggested he'd seen terrible things and remained unimpressed. "Miss Casey," the lean one said, his voice polite, almost gentle. "I'm Marcus. This is Dante. Mr. Maloney requests your presence this morning." "I was sleeping," I said stupidly, clutching my threadbare robe closed. Through the gap in the doorway, I could see Mrs. Chen across the hall peeking through her security chain, her eyes wide with alarm. "We brought coffee," Marcus said, as if that explained everything. He held up a carrier with 2 cups from the artisan cafe 3 blocks away, the one I'd never been able to afford. Caramel macchiato, extra shot, almond milk, and some pastries. The chocolate croissants looked fresh. My blood went cold. That was my order, the one I'd gotten exactly twice when a regular left me a $100 tip. They'd been watching me, learning my routines, my preferences. The violation of it made my skin crawl. "And if I refuse?" I asked, though we both knew the answer. Dante smiled, and it was not a kind expression. "Mr. Maloney doesn't like to be kept waiting, Miss Casey. But he's a reasonable man. He simply wants to talk." Marcus adjusted his glasses with one hand, and I caught the telltale bulge of a shoulder holster beneath his jacket. "We can wait while you get dressed. Take your time. We're not going anywhere." 20 minutes later, I was sitting in the back of a black Mercedes sedan that smelled like leather and money, watching the city wake up through tinted windows. Marcus drove with the calm competence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Dante sat beside me, not quite touching, not quite threatening, sipping his coffee and checking his phone with the casual air of a man on his morning commute. He'd insisted I take my coffee and croissant, had even made sure I had a napkin. The surreal politeness of it all was somehow more terrifying than outright intimidation would have been. The penthouse occupied the entire 42nd floor of a glass tower that looked out over the city like a throne. The elevator opened directly into the apartment, and I stepped out onto floors so polished I could see my reflection. The space was enormous, all clean lines and carefully curated emptiness. Modern minimalist furniture in shades of gray and white, floor-to-ceiling windows that made the sky feel close enough to touch. And on every wall, traditional Korean art ink paintings of mountains and tigers, delicate calligraphy scrolls, ceramic vases that looked ancient and priceless. Byron stood at the windows, his back to me, wearing dark jeans and a black Henley that somehow made him look more dangerous than the suit had. His tattoos were fully visible now, intricate patterns that wound up his forearms like living things. "Thank you, gentlemen," he said without turning around. "That will be all." Marcus and Dante left without a word, and I heard the elevator doors close with a finality that made my throat tight. I was alone with him, 42 floors above the street, with nowhere to run and no one who knew where I was. Byron finally turned, and his expression was unreadable. "You didn't call." "I was busy." He smiled slightly, acknowledging the lie. "Sit, please." It wasn't really a request. I sat on a pristine white sofa that probably cost more than I made in a year, my cheap jeans and faded sweater a stain on his perfect aesthetic. He moved to a sideboard where a traditional Korean tea set was already prepared, the kind my mother had owned before she sold it to pay rent. He poured with practiced efficiency, and when he handed me the cup, the scent hit me like a physical blow. Yuja-cha, honey citron tea. My mother had made it every Sunday, brewing it strong and sweet, serving it in mismatched mugs while she told me stories about Seoul. I took the cup with shaking hands, and Byron sat across from me, his dark eyes never leaving my face. "Now," he said softly, "let's talk about your mother, and mine, and what you're going to do for me." The tea burned my tongue, but I welcomed the pain. It gave me something to focus on besides the way Byron was looking at me, like I was a puzzle he'd already solved but wanted to watch me figure out myself. "Your mother's name was Jung-mi-sun," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Born in Seoul, Gangnam District, 1975. She immigrated to the United States in 2003 with her husband, an Irish-American man named Patrick Casey. You were born here in 2005. Your birth name was Han Seo-yeon." I set the teacup down carefully, afraid I might drop it. "How do you—" "Patrick Casey died in a car accident in 2019. Your mother died in the same crash." He continued as if I hadn't spoken, his voice clinical, detached. "You were 19. You spent the next 2 years in foster care until you aged out of the system at 21. You've been working minimum wage jobs ever since, moving from city to city, never staying anywhere long enough to build a life. You changed your legal name to just Sean Casey when you turned 22. dropped the Han entirely. Each fact landed like a physical blow. The thoroughness of his investigation, the casual violation of every private corner of my life. It made me feel stripped, bare, exposed. You had no right. I had every right, he interrupted, and for the first time there was heat in his voice. Because your mother was my mother's best friend. Because Charvalita has spent 20 years mourning a woman she thought was dead. Because you... He leaned forward, his dark eyes boring into mine. You're the answer to questions my mother has been asking since I was 18 years old. He stood abruptly and walked to a desk against the far wall. When he returned, he carried a small leather photo album, the kind that looked old and well-loved, the edges soft with handling. He sat beside me on the couch, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from him, and opened the album across both our laps. The first photograph stole my breath. 2 young women, maybe 25, sitting at a pojangmatcha, a Korean street food tent. They had their arms around each other, faces flushed with soju and laughter, looking at the camera with the kind of joy that comes from being young and invincible. One of them was unmistakably Charvalita, decades younger but with the same elegant bone structure, the same warm eyes. The other was my mother. Oh God, I whispered, my hand moving involuntarily toward the photograph. I'd had exactly 3 pictures of my mother, all lost when I moved from my last apartment 6 months ago. I'd thought I'd never see her face again. They met in Seoul in 2001, Byron said, his voice gentler now. My mother was teaching English. Your mother was working at a luxury hotel, training to be a manager. They became inseparable. He turned the page. More photographs. My mother and Charvalita at Namsan Tower, at a Noribang, sitting on the steps of a traditional hanok. In every image, they looked like sisters, like 2 halves of the same whole. What happened? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Byron's jaw tightened. Your mother was married before she met Patrick Casey, to a man named Kim Tae-sung. He chose his words carefully, connected to the wrong people, dangerous people. He was violent. My mother tried to help her leave, but it was complicated. Tae-sung had ties to a gang that made it impossible for your mother to simply disappear. He turned to another page. A photograph of my mother with a black eye, trying to smile for the camera. Charvalita beside her, her expression fierce and protective. I felt bile rise in my throat. In 2003, my mother met my father, Frank Maloney, Irish-American, in Seoul on business. They fell in love, got married quickly. When they decided to move to the States, my mother convinced him to help your mother escape. They staged it to look like your mother had died in a house fire, paid people off, got her new documents, brought her here with them. I never knew, I said numbly. She never told me any of this. She was protecting you, Byron said. Tae-sung had connections everywhere, even here. Your mother couldn't risk anyone knowing she'd survived. So she married Patrick Casey. Had you tried to build a normal life? But she must have stayed in contact with my mother, at least for a while. These photos, he gestured to the later pages, images of my mother pregnant, of me as a baby. My mother has been keeping them for 20 years. I traced my finger over a photograph of my mother holding me, maybe 6 months old, her smile radiant with exhausted new mother joy. When did they lose touch? Around 2010. My mother says they had an argument about something. She can't remember what. And then nothing. Silence. She tried to find her, but your mother had gotten good at disappearing. And then, his voice hardened again. 5 years ago, my mother found a death certificate. Jungmi-sun, deceased in a car accident. 2019. She spent every day since believing she failed your mother, that she drove her away and couldn't save her a second time. He closed the album with a soft thud. 3 months ago, my mother was diagnosed with early-stage dementia. Some days, she's fine. Other days, she forgets where she is, who I am. But she always remembers me, son. She calls out for her, apologizes to her, begs her forgiveness. The tea had gone cold in my cup. Outside, the sun was fully up now, the city spreading below us like a game board. I felt dizzy, unmoored, like everything I'd thought I knew about my life had been revealed as a carefully constructed lie. Why are you telling me this? I asked, though I already knew. Byron turned to face me fully, and his expression was hard, immovable. Because you're going to help me give my mother peace. You're going to visit her, talk to her in Korean, let her see that Mi-sun's daughter survived, that her sacrifice meant something. You're going to give her the closure she needs before this disease takes everything from her. And if I refuse? Something flickered in his eyes, not quite anger, not quite pity. You won't refuse, because despite everything you've told yourself, you want this too. You want to know your mother's real story. You want to understand why she kept so many secrets. And because, he leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, men like me don't ask twice. He stood, taking the album with him, and I felt its absence like a physical loss. I'll have Marcus and Dante pick you up Sunday at noon. Dress nicely. My mother likes traditional respect. He paused at the windows, his back to me. Oh, and Sean? You can quit your job at the restaurant. I've already paid off your debts and arranged for a new apartment. Your things will be moved this week. Consider it a signing bonus. I didn't agree to anything, I said, but my voice had no strength behind it. Byron glanced back over his shoulder, and his smile was sharp enough to cut. Yes, you did. The moment you spoke Korean to my mother, you just didn't know it yet. Marcus drove me to a coffee shop 3 blocks from my apartment and waited in the car while I sat at a corner table, staring at nothing, trying to process what had just happened. An hour later, a courier arrived with a manila envelope containing documents that laid out my new life with the clinical precision of a business contract. I read them twice, then a third time, each clause more surreal than the last. The apartment was in a building I'd walked past 100 times, the kind with a doorman and actual security, where the rent was probably triple what I currently paid. The monthly stipend was more than I made in 6 months of double shifts and humiliating tips. My student loan debt, the $15,000 that had been hanging over me like a guillotine since I dropped out of community college, would be paid in full by the end of the week. It was everything I needed. Everything I'd been desperately scrambling for since I aged out of foster care and realized no one was coming to save me. And all I had to do was pretend to care about a dying woman who'd loved my mother. The thought made me sick. I called the number on Byron's business card from the coffee shop's bathroom, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped my phone twice. He answered on the first ring, like he'd been waiting. I want to negotiate, I said, before he could speak, before I could lose my nerve. There was a pause, then a sound that might have been amusement. Go on. I'm not signing anything until we talk. In person. Somewhere public. Marcus will bring you back. No. I cut him off, surprised by the force in my own voice. Somewhere public. Somewhere with witnesses. Or this ends now. Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke, there was something new in his tone, curiosity maybe, or grudging respect. There's a Korean restaurant in Koreatown. Myeongdong Grill. Be there at 7 tonight. Come alone. He hung up before I could respond. Myeongdong Grill was small and authentic, the kind of place where the menu was only in Korean and the ajumas who ran it looked at non-Korean customers with mild suspicion. I arrived 15 minutes early and chose a table in the back corner where I could see both exits. Old habits from foster care, from learning that escape routes mattered more than comfort. Byron arrived exactly at 7, dressed in dark slacks and a navy sweater that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. He slid into the seat across from me with the fluid grace of someone who'd never been uncomfortable anywhere in his life. The ajuma appeared immediately with banchan and water, greeting him in Korean like he was a regular, her stern expression softening into something almost maternal. You come here often? I asked, once she'd left. My mother and I have Sunday lunch here when she's having a good day. He picked up his chopsticks, selected a piece of kimchi with the ease of long practice. The food reminds her of home. Sometimes that's enough to keep her grounded. The casual intimacy of the detail unsettled me. It was easier to hate him when he was just a monster in an expensive suit, harder when he was a son trying to hold on to his mother's fading memory. I read your contract, I said, pulling the envelope from my bag, and I have conditions. I assumed you would. That's why we're here. He gestured for me to continue, his expression neutral. I'd spent the afternoon making a list on the back of a napkin, crossing out and rewriting until my thoughts were clear. First, I want the full truth about my mother. Everything. Not just the sanitized version you told me this morning. I want to know who Kim Tae-sung was, what he did to her, why she was so afraid that she had to fake her own death. I want names, dates, details. Byron studied me for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. Some of those details are dangerous. Tae-sung is still alive, still connected. I don't care. If I'm doing this, I need to know what I'm walking into, what my mother was running from. He nodded slowly. Agreed. I'll give you everything I have. Second, I won't lie to your mother. Not directly. I'll omit things. I'll redirect conversations. But I won't fabricate stories about my mother's life or her death. If Charvalita asks me direct questions, I'm going to answer honestly. That's acceptable. My mother's memory is fractured enough that omission will be sufficient. His voice was matter of fact, but I caught the flash of pain in his eyes. She rarely asks questions anymore. Mostly she just wants to talk about the past. Third, I met his gaze, held it, refused to flinch. You never threaten me again, ever. No more showing up at my apartment at dawn with armed men. No more surveillance. No more of this. I gestured at the contract, at him, at everything. This casual violation of my privacy. If we're doing this, we do it with mutual respect, or we don't do it at all. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the sizzle of meat on nearby grills and the low murmur of Korean conversation around us. Byron set down his chopsticks carefully, deliberately, and I watched his jaw tighten. "And if I refuse your terms?" he asked quietly. "Then I walk out of here right now. You can keep your money, your apartment, your whole carefully constructed plan. I'll disappear, just like my mother did, and you can explain to Charvalita why the daughter of her best friend chose not to know her. It was a bluff, mostly. I had nowhere to run, no resources to disappear with. But something in my voice must have been convincing because Byron leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You have more spine than I expected," he said finally, "from someone who makes themselves so small." The words landed like a slap, not because they were cruel, but because they were accurate. I had made myself small. For years, I'd practiced invisibility like it was a survival skill, convinced that being seen meant being vulnerable, being hurt, and here I was, demanding to be treated with dignity by a man who could destroy me with a phone call. "Is that a yes?" I pressed, refusing to let him see how much the observation stung. Byron picked up the contract and, without breaking eye contact, tore it cleanly in half. "We'll draft a new one, with your conditions included, but I have one of my own." "What?" "You give this a real chance, not just going through the motions for the money. My mother is." He paused, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked uncertain, vulnerable. "She's all I have, and she's slipping away a little more every day. So if you're going to do this, I need you to actually try, to care. Can you do that?" I thought about the photographs in his apartment, my mother's face bright with laughter, her arm around Charvalita like they were family. I thought about the years I'd spent alone, orphaned twice over, once by death, once by my mother's secrets. I thought about the question that had haunted me since the car accident. Who was she, really, before she became my mother? "Yes," I said, "I can do that." Byron extended his hand across the table. "Then we have a deal." I shook it, his grip warm and firm, and wondered what kind of devil's bargain I'd just made. Sunday arrived too quickly. I'd spent the intervening days in a fog of surreal transitions, movers packing my meager belongings from the studio apartment, keys to a one-bedroom with actual sunlight, and a kitchen that didn't smell like mold, a bank account that suddenly had 5 figures instead of 2. I kept waiting for it to disappear, for someone to realize there'd been a mistake, that girls like me didn't get rescued. But the nightmare that had become my life remained stubbornly real. I woke at dawn on Sunday, and spent 3 hours making teok Korean rice cakes from a recipe I'd found in a water-stained cookbook that had been one of the few things salvaged from my mother's apartment after the pro-day accident. My hands remembered the motions even though my mind had tried to forget. The careful measuring of sweet rice flour, the precise steaming time, the delicate shaping. My mother had made these every Sunday, had insisted I learn even when I complained that none of my friends ate weird ethnic food. I wished desperately that I could tell her I understood now, that I was sorry for being embarrassed by the language she spoke, the food she cooked, the stories she tried to share about a country I'd never seen, that I understood why she'd kept secrets not because she didn't trust me, but because she loved me enough to protect me from a past that could still reach forward and destroy. Marcus arrived at 11:30 in the same black Mercedes. He took one look at the container of teok and smiled, the expression transforming his usually stern face into something almost kind. "Mrs. Langford will appreciate that. She hasn't had homemade tuck in years." The Maloney estate sat 20 minutes outside the city, hidden behind stone walls and iron gates that opened silently as we approached. The house itself was massive but somehow not ostentatious, a sprawling modern structure with clean lines and walls of glass, surrounded by gardens that blended traditional Korean landscaping with American sensibilities. Stone lanterns marked pathways between carefully pruned pines. A small pond reflected the sky, koi moving beneath the surface like flashes of copper and gold. It was beautiful. It was also a fortress. Marcus led me through the front entrance into a foyer with floors of pale wood and walls decorated with Korean ink paintings, mountains emerging from mist, tigers prowling through bamboo forests. Everything was curated with the kind of taste that came from genuine love, rather than expensive designers trying to approximate culture they didn't understand. "She's in the sunroom," Marcus said, gesturing down a hallway. "Mr. Maloney is in his study if you need anything. Take your time." I found Charvalita in a room that was more greenhouse than living space, surrounded by windows that looked out over the gardens. She sat in a comfortable chair near a low table set for tea, dressed in a beautiful hanbok-inspired blouse and slacks. Her silver hair swept up in an elegant twist. The room smelled like jasmine and earth. She looked up as I entered, and I watched recognition bloom across her face, not of me, but of something in me that reminded her of someone long gone. "Seo Yana," she said softly, using the affectionate diminutive in Korean, and her eyes filled with tears. I crossed the room carefully, setting the container of taeok on the table before kneeling beside her chair. "Nay, Harmony. Choyeo." "Yes, grandmother. It's me." Her hands rose to my face, trembling, cupping my cheeks the way my mother used to when I was small. Her palms were warm and soft, and she studied my features with the intensity of someone trying to memorize a face before it disappeared. "You have me son's eyes," she whispered. "I thought I'd lost everyone. I thought I'd failed her. Failed you." "You didn't fail anyone," I said, my own voice thick with tears I hadn't expected. "She spoke of you. Always. She said you saved her life." It wasn't entirely a lie. My mother had kept a photograph of Charvalita hidden in her Bible, had sometimes looked at it with an expression I now recognized as grief mixed with gratitude. She'd just never told me who the woman was, or why she mattered. Charvalita pulled me into an embrace that smelled like expensive perfume, and something underneath it ginger, maybe, or the herbal tea she'd been drinking. She held me like I was precious, like I was the answer to prayers I hadn't known she'd been praying, and something in my chest cracked open. We sat together and she poured tea with shaking hands, exclaiming over the taeok I'd brought, insisting I eat even though I couldn't taste anything past the lump in my throat. And then she began to talk. She told me about meeting my mother in Seoul in 2001, both of them young and ambitious and lonely in different ways. About late nights in Pojangmacha drinking soju and dreaming about the future. About the day my mother introduced her to Kim Tae-sung and how Charvalita had known immediately that something was wrong the way my mother flinched when he touched her, the bruises she tried to hide with makeup and long sleeves. "I didn't understand at first," Charvalita said, her Korean fluid despite the years in America. "In Korea, we didn't talk about these things. A man's home was his domain. But me son, your mother, she was so bright, so full of life. And I watched him extinguish that light piece by piece." She described Tae-sung with the matter-of-fact tone of someone recounting history. A mid-level enforcer for a gang that controlled protection rackets and gambling operations in Seoul's entertainment district. Charming in public, monstrous in private. Connected enough that my mother couldn't simply leave without consequences. When I met Frank, my husband, I knew I had to help her escape. Frank had money, connections, resources. We planned it carefully. Made it look like an accident. A gas leak and fire in her apartment while Tae-sung was away on business. We bribed the right people, got her new documents, brought her here with us. Charvalita's voice broke. She was so grateful, so determined to start over. And for a while, it worked. She met Patrick. Had you built a life? "What happened?" I asked. "Why did you stop talking?" Charvalita's expression clouded, confusion flickering across her face. "I don't. There was an argument. About Frank, I think. Or maybe about Tae-sung. She said I didn't understand. That I'd put us all in danger by..." She pressed her fingers to her temples, frustrated. "I can't remember. The doctors say the memories are fragmenting, mixing with dreams until I can't tell what's real anymore." I covered her hands with mine. "It's okay. It doesn't matter now. But it does," she insisted, gripping my fingers with surprising strength. "Because 5 years after we stopped speaking, I learned she was dead, and I never got to apologize. Never got to tell her I was sorry, that I should have tried harder to protect her, to keep her safe." Tears tracked through her makeup. "And now you're here, and you're alive, and I get a second chance. Do you understand? You're my second chance." I looked up and found Byron standing in the doorway, exactly as he'd said he would be. But his expression wasn't cold or calculating as I'd expected. He was watching his mother with naked grief, watching her fracture in real time, and I saw in his face the same desperate hope I felt building in my chest. This wasn't just about giving Charvalita peace. It was about salvaging something from the wreckage of secrets and lies and time that had run out too soon. "I'm here," I told Charvalita, squeezing her hands. "I'm not going anywhere." And as I said it, I realized it might actually be true. The changes started small. I returned to my new apartment after that first Sunday to find the locks had been replaced, not just upgraded, but completely overhauled with the kind of security system that required both a key card and a fingerprint scan. A doorman I'd never seen before greeted me by name in the lobby, his eyes sharp and assessing in a way that had nothing to do with hospitality and everything to do with threat assessment. Mrs. Chen from my old building, who'd moved into the unit next door Byron's doing, I later learned. Relocating her at his expense, knocked on my door the next morning with homemade dumplings and questions in her eyes. She was too polite to ask aloud, but I saw it in the way she looked at me now. With respect tinged by wariness, the kind of careful distance people maintain around those who've been marked by power. I'd become someone who mattered, someone dangerous by association. The feeling followed me everywhere. At the grocery store, the security guard nodded to me with deference I hadn't earned. The barista at the coffee shop refused my payment, saying it had been taken care of and I knew without asking by whom. Even my landlord, who I'd never met, sent a handwritten note welcoming me to the building and assuring me that any concerns would receive immediate personal attention. Byron Maloney had wrapped me in layers of protection I hadn't asked for and couldn't refuse, and every kindness felt like another link in a chain I didn't know how to break. I'd kept my job at the restaurant despite Byron's suggestion. I quit partly out of stubborn independence, mostly because I needed somewhere that felt real, untouched by the surreal transformation my life had undergone. But even that sanctuary was compromised. He started appearing during my shifts, never made a reservation, just walked in and took whatever table was available in my section. He'd order something simple, steak, water, nothing that required attention, and then he'd watch me. Not with Marco's crude hunger or the calculating dismissal of that first night. This was something else entirely. Focused, intense, like he was trying to solve an equation that didn't quite add up. It made my skin prickle with awareness, made me hyper-conscious of every movement, every interaction with other customers. I'd catch myself smoothing my apron, checking my reflection in the polished surfaces, hating myself for caring what he thought. He left tips that made the other servers whisper. $500 on a $40 check, 1,000 once, with a note in Korean that simply said "감사합니다, thank you." Jennifer started asking pointed questions about our relationship, and I didn't know how to explain that we didn't have one, that I was just a convenient tool in his effort to comfort his dying mother. Except it was starting to feel like more than that. Robert, the restaurant manager, pulled me aside after Byron's fourth visit. His hands shook slightly as he poured himself a shot of vodka from the bar stock, something I'd never seen him do during service. "Are you involved with Byron Maloney?" he asked, not quite meeting my eyes. "It's complicated," I said, because what else could I say? That I was an employee? A friend of the family? A ghost from his mother's past brought back to life through coercion and desperation? "Be careful," Robert said quietly. "Men like him, they don't do things without reason. If he's showing interest, it means something. Just be careful." The warning lodged itself somewhere behind my ribs, a splinter I couldn't extract. By the third Sunday, I'd fallen into a rhythm with Charvalita. We'd have tea. I'd tell her carefully edited stories about my mother's life with Patrick. She'd share memories of soul that sometimes shifted between decades without warning. Byron usually watched from a distance, present but not intrusive, his expression unreadable. But that Sunday, as the sun set and painted the sunroom gold, Charvalita reached for my hand with sudden urgency. "Stay tonight," she said. "Please. I don't have many good days left, and I want to pretend, just for one night, that I have my family back." I looked to Byron, standing in the doorway. He gave the slightest nod. "I'd be honored," I told her. The guest room was on the second floor, down a hallway lined with more of those ink paintings. Someone Byron, I assumed, had prepared it carefully. The bed was made with crisp white linens and a traditional Korean duvet cover embroidered with cranes. Korean textiles draped the walls, pojagi patchwork, a ceremonial costume behind glass. And on the dresser, a collection of photographs I recognized from Byron's album. My mother, young and bright-eyed, laughing at something off camera. My mother and Charvalita at what looked like a festival, wearing matching handboks. My mother holding me as a newborn, her expression tender and fierce and terrified all at once. I was still staring at the photographs when the knock came, soft and tentative. Byron stood in the hallway holding a tray with a teapot and 2 cups, still dressed in the dark slacks and sweater he'd worn at dinner. But something about him was different, unguarded, almost uncertain. "Thought you might have trouble sleeping," he said. "The house is strange when you're not used to it." He poured tea that smelled like chamomile and honey, and we sat in the window seat overlooking the gardens, the silence between us comfortable in a way I hadn't expected. "Thank you," he said finally. "For today, for all the Sundays. She's been more herself these past few weeks than she's been in months. She's easy to care about," I said honestly. "She reminds me of my mother, the version I was too young to really know." Byron was quiet for a long moment, staring into his tea. "My father was violent," he said abruptly. "For years. My mother stayed because she thought she had to, because she'd left everyone she knew behind to come here, because Frank Maloney had saved her once, and she convinced herself she owed him everything." I went very still, afraid that moving would break whatever spell had made him willing to share this. "I was 12 when she finally left him. Took me in the middle of the night with nothing but the clothes we were wearing and the money she'd been hiding for months. She worked 3 jobs to keep us fed, slept 4 hours a night, never complained once." His voice was rough with something that might have been old rage or current grief. "She gave up everything, her friends, her language, her whole fucking identity to save me. And now she's disappearing piece by piece, and I can't save her back." He looked at me then, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "So when I say I'd do anything to give her peace, I mean it. Anything, including forcing a scared waitress into weekly dinners and making her relive trauma she spent years trying to forget. I'm not as scared as I was," I admitted. "And it's not just trauma anymore. I struggled for the right words. It's finding pieces of my mother I didn't know existed. It's understanding why she kept secrets. It's having something that feels like family, even if it's complicated and built on lies." Byron set down his tea and turned to face me fully. In the moonlight streaming through the window, his features were softer, younger, almost vulnerable. "It doesn't have to be built on lies," he said quietly. "Not anymore. Not if you don't want it to be." I didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know what he was offering or what I wanted to accept, so I just sat there, in a room filled with ghosts of my mother, drinking tea with a dangerous man who was maybe, impossibly, becoming something like a friend. 6 weeks became a lifetime compressed into Sundays and stolen weekday evenings when Charvalita asked for me and Byron would send Marcus to collect me from the restaurant. The boundaries I'd tried to maintain employee and employer, transaction and relationship blurred until I couldn't find them anymore. Byron started teaching me things. Not intentionally at first, just answering my questions when I asked about a phone call I'd overheard or a tense conversation with one of his associates. But gradually, the lessons became deliberate. He'd explain the difference between legitimate leverage and extortion, between protection and exploitation. He showed me how reputation could be more powerful than violence, how the threat of action often mattered more than the action itself. "Most of what people believe about me is theater," he said one evening, sitting across from me in his study while Charvalita napped upstairs. "I haven't personally hurt anyone in 5 years. Don't need to. The reputation does the work for me. Keeps the real predators away from my family, my business, the people I care about." "But you did hurt people," I said. "Before." "Yes." He didn't flinch from it. "When my father was alive, I did things I'm not proud of to protect my mother and build something he couldn't take away. And when he died, I did more things to make sure no one else could step into his place. But now," he gestured at the sleek office, the computers displaying shipping manifests and inventory reports. "90% of my business is legitimate. Import-export, exactly like the website says. The other 10% is reputation management." I should have been frightened. Should have run. But instead, I found myself fascinated by the chess game he described. The careful balance of power and perception, loyalty and fear. He had a strategic mind that saw 10 moves ahead, that understood human nature with clinical precision. And he was showing me the board, teaching me the rules, like he was preparing me for something. But Charvalita was getting worse. The lucid days became rare treasures. She'd call me mi-san more often than Seoyun. Would tell me the same stories 3 times in an hour. Would sometimes look at Byron with blank confusion and ask where her son was. Each episode carved something out of him that I watched him struggle to hide. The breaking point came on a Wednesday evening. I'd stopped by after my shift to find Charvalita in the sunroom, agitated and calling for someone named Jinho, her father, Byron told me quietly, dead for 30 years. Nothing we did could calm her. She pushed away the tea I offered, flinched from Byron's touch like he was a stranger, demanded in increasingly frantic Korean to be taken home to Seoul. Byron tried everything. Spoke to her gently in Korean, showed her familiar photographs, held her hands and told her she was safe, but she looked through him like he didn't exist, like he was just another threatening stranger in a world that had become incomprehensible. "Where's my son?" she finally asked, looking directly at Byron, with tears streaming down her face. "Where's Byron? I want my son." I watched something in him shatter. He stood abruptly, mumbled something about calling her doctor, and walked out. I found him 10 minutes later in the darkened hallway outside his study, back against the wall, head in his hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I didn't think. Just crossed the space between us and pulled him into my arms the way Charvalita had held me that first Sunday. He resisted for maybe 3 seconds, then collapsed into me like a building whose foundation had finally crumbled. He was solid and warm and shaking, and I held him while he grieved for the mother who was disappearing while still breathing, still speaking, still looking at him with eyes that no longer recognized the child she'd sacrificed everything to save. "I'm losing her," he said against my shoulder, his voice raw. "Every day, I'm losing more of her. And I can't stop it. Can't fix it. Can't do a fucking thing except watch her fade." "I know," I whispered, stroking his hair without thinking about whether I had the right. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." We stayed like that for a long time, long enough that my legs went numb and my arms ached, long enough that the sun finished setting and left us in darkness, long enough that when he finally pulled back, something between us had shifted irrevocably. He looked at me with red-rimmed eyes and said, "I need to tell you something. The truth. All of it." We went to his study. He poured whiskey for both of us, even though I rarely drank, and I didn't argue. The first sip burned, but the second went down easier. "When I found you," Byron began, not meeting my eyes, "when I realized who you were, I didn't just see an opportunity to comfort my mother. I saw insurance, a way to bind you to this family so you couldn't leave, so you couldn't break her heart the way your mother did." The words should have made me angry, should have confirmed every fear I'd had about his motives, but I just sat there, listening, because I'd suspected as much and chosen to stay anyway. "I was going to trap you," he continued, his voice flat with self-loathing. "Use your financial dependence, your desire to know about your mother, your growing attachment to mine. I was going to make it impossible for you to leave. And then," he finally looked at me, and his expression was naked, vulnerable in a way that made my chest tight. "Then I fell in love with you." The confession hung in the air between us like smoke. I couldn't breathe around it, couldn't think past the sudden thunder of my pulse. "I love the way you make yourself small and then surprise everyone with how much space you actually take up," he said, words tumbling out now like he couldn't stop them. "I love how you speak Korean with my mother like you're giving her pieces of heaven. I love your quiet strength, the way you've survived everything life threw at you and still choose kindness. I love watching you move through the world like you're apologizing for existing when you should be demanding everyone make room." "Byron, I want to keep you," he interrupted, his voice breaking. "God, I want to keep you so badly it terrifies me, but not like this. Not through money or obligation or coercion, not because you think you owe me something or because leaving would hurt my mother. I want you to stay because you want to, because you choose this. Choose me." I set down my whiskey with a hand that wasn't quite steady. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm going to change the terms of our deal. I'm going to give you a way out. Complete financial independence, enough money that you'll never have to worry again, even if you walk away from all of this tomorrow. And then," he took a shaky breath, "then I'm going to ask you to stay anyway. Not for my mother, for me, and pray to God you say yes." Outside, rain had started falling, drops hitting the windows like 1,000 small heartbeats. Inside, I sat across from a dangerous man who just handed me his heart and asked me not to break it. "When?" I asked quietly. "Soon. I'm having the papers drawn up. Next week, maybe." His eyes searched mine, desperate for something I wasn't sure I could give. "I need to know you're here because you want to be, even if the answer destroys me." The documents arrived on a Sunday morning, delivered by Marcus in a leather portfolio that probably cost more than my first car. Byron waited for me in his study, looking like he hadn't slept. The circles under his eyes were dark enough to be bruises, and his hands trembled slightly as he poured coffee he didn't drink. "Sit," he said, and there was none of the command in his voice that used to make my spine stiffen. Just exhaustion and something that looked like resignation. I sat. He pushed the portfolio across the desk like it might burn him. Inside were 3 sets of documents, each paper-clipped and labeled with tabs in his precise handwriting. The first was a trust fund, $2 million, managed by an independent firm, accessible only by me. The second was a complete identity package: new social security number, birth certificate, driver's license, passport. The name on them was Sarah Mitchell. Generic and forgettable. Everything I'd need to disappear completely. The third was a letter of recommendation on official letterhead from Byron's attorney, written for Miss Sean Casey, applying to university programs. It detailed fictional volunteer work and character references that would open doors I'd thought were closed forever. "The trust fund is active as of this morning," Byron said, still not looking at me. "The identity documents are legal, don't ask me how. And that letter will get you into any school you want. Full ride if you need it. I have connections." I stared at the papers, at the careful handwriting, at the escape route he'd built for me with the same meticulous attention he gave everything else. "You were right to make yourself invisible," he continued, his voice rough. "I've been thinking about what you said that first night at the restaurant, about making yourself small to survive. And I realized you learned that because people like me taught you that being seen was dangerous." He finally looked up, and his eyes were devastating. "My world destroys beautiful things, Sean. It takes people who are good and kind and bright, and it twists them until they're just survival mechanisms and scar tissue. I won't be the one who destroys you." The rain outside had intensified, drumming against the windows like it was trying to get in, or maybe trying to drown us out. Give us privacy for this moment that felt too raw for witnesses. "So this is it?" I asked. "You're just letting me go?" "I'm giving you the choice I should have given you from the beginning." He stood and walked to the window, presenting me with his back, his shoulders rigid with tension. "Take the money. Take the new identity. Disappear if you want. Or take the letter and build the life you should have had before your mother died and the world decided you didn't matter. Either way, you're free. No obligations. No debt. No strings." I looked at the documents again. At my mother's photograph on Byron's desk, young and laughing, her arm around Charvalita like they were sisters. I thought about the stories Charvalita had shared over the past weeks. How my mother had run from Kim Tae-sung, had faked her death, had spent the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. How she taught me to be small, to be invisible, to never draw attention because attention meant danger. She'd survived by erasing herself, and then she died anyway, in a random accident that didn't care about her carefully constructed invisibility. What had all that fear bought her? What had all that hiding protected her from, in the end? I stood up, the documents clutched in my hands, and walked around the desk to where Byron stood. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge me, just stared out at the rain-soaked gardens like they held answers neither of us could find. "My mother ran," I said quietly. "She spent 20 years running, and she died afraid, alone, without the people who loved her. That's what invisibility bought her, not safety, just a slower form of dying." I tore the first document in half, then quarters, then eighths. The sound of ripping paper filled the study like thunder. Byron spun around, his eyes wide. "Sean." I tore up the second set of documents. "Sarah Mitchell ceased to exist before she ever lived." "What are you doing?" He reached for me, his hands hovering near mine like he was afraid to touch, afraid I might shatter. "I'm done making myself small," I said, ripping up the letter of recommendation. The pieces fell like snow around our feet. "I'm done apologizing for taking up space. I'm done hiding from people who might hurt me just because they might. Because living that way," my voice cracked, "that's not living at all. You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying." I grabbed his face between my hands, forcing him to look at me. Really look at me. "I'm saying I choose this. I choose you. I choose your mother, and these Sundays, and this dangerous, complicated, impossible situation. But I'm not choosing it because I owe you, not because I'm afraid to leave. I'm choosing it because, for the first time in my life, I'm not invisible. I'm seen, and it terrifies me and exhilarates me, and I want more of it. Sean." His hands came up to cover mine, his thumbs stroking my wrists. "But we're doing this on my terms," I continued, my voice steadier now. "I'm not your obligation. I'm not your possession. I'm not another thing you protect because that's what you do. I'm your partner. You're equal. And that means honesty about your business, your past, your world. That means I get a say in decisions that affect me. That means if we're building something together, we're actually building it together. Byron stared at me like I'd just performed a miracle. Like I was something rare and precious he'd found by accident, and couldn't believe he got to keep. You're choosing me, he said, like he needed to hear it again to believe it. I'm choosing us, I corrected. The real version, not the one built on contracts and coercion, the one where we're both terrified and vulnerable and choosing it anyway. He pulled me against him, burying his face in my hair, his arms wrapping around me like I might disappear if he didn't hold tight enough. I don't deserve you. Probably not, I agreed, and felt him laugh, the sound muffled and wet. But you get me anyway. If you want me. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his eyes bright with tears, and something that looked like hope. Then we do this right, he said. No more half measures. No more pretending this is temporary or transactional. If you're staying, if you're choosing this, he took my hands in his, bringing them to his lips, then I'm going to marry you. The words should have terrified me. We'd known each other less than 2 months. He was a dangerous man with a complicated past and a world I barely understood. But looking at him, at the vulnerability in his expression, at the way he was offering me everything he was without reservation. Yes, I said. But we're doing this properly. Dating, getting to know each other outside of Sunday dinners and your mother's illness. Building something real before we make it permanent. Byron smiled, and it transformed his entire face. Whatever you want, however long you need, I'm not going anywhere. Through the study windows, I could see Charvalita in the sunroom with one of her nurses, gesturing animatedly as she told some story I couldn't hear. The rain had started to clear, and sunlight was breaking through the clouds, painting everything in shades of gold. I'd spent my entire adult life running from the possibility of this, of being known, of being chosen, of mattering enough that someone would fight to keep me. And now I was standing in a study filled with torn-up freedom, holding hands with a man who'd given me every reason to leave and then asked me to stay anyway. My mother had chosen invisibility and died invisible. I was choosing to be seen. Whatever came next, at least it would be real. Charvalita passed on a Sunday in late autumn when the gardens were painted in shades of rust and gold. We were in the sunroom as always, afternoon light slanting through the windows like it was trying to touch her one last time. She'd been having a good day recognizing both of us, telling stories about soul with perfect clarity, laughing at Byron's terrible attempts to flip the pigeon I'd made for lunch. Then, mid-sentence, she went quiet. Her hand found mine, then reached for Byron's, bringing them together in her lap like she was physically binding us to each other. "Misana," she whispered, looking at me with eyes that suddenly seemed to see past this moment into something else entirely. "다를 보내줘서 고마워. 이제 집에 갈 수 있어. Misun, thank you for sending your daughter home. Now I can go home too." Byron's voice broke. "Mom, 사랑해요, 아들. I love you, son." She squeezed our hands once, hard, then her grip loosened, her eyes closed like she was just resting, just catching her breath before the next story. But I felt the moment she left, felt it like a string snapping, like the world tilting slightly on its axis and settling into a new position. Byron made a sound I'll never forget, grief and relief and devastation all compressed into a single broken exhale. I held him as he cried, his tears soaking into my shoulder while autumn light painted his mother's peaceful face in gold. She looked younger in death, the tension of dementia finally released, leaving behind only the echo of the woman who'd saved my mother and loved her son with the kind of ferocity that moved mountains. We sat with her until the light changed, and the hospice nurse came to check vitals she already knew would be absent. Byron wouldn't let go of his mother's hand until I whispered in Korean that she was home now, that she'd found me son again, that they were probably already laughing together in some celestial pojangmatcha, drinking soju and sharing secrets we'd never know. He looked at me then, his face ravaged, and said, "Thank you, for giving her this, for giving her you." The funeral was 3 days later, and it was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. Byron had planned it meticulously, honoring every complicated piece of his mother's identity. The morning began with a Buddhist ceremony in a temple filled with the scent of incense and chrysanthemums. A monk chanted sutras while we knelt on cushions, and I listened to Korean prayers for safe passage that my mother had never taught me but that somehow felt like coming home. Then we moved to a Catholic church for a full funeral mass, Because Charvalita had converted when she married Frank Maloney and never quite let go of either faith. The priest spoke about resurrection and eternal life, and the juxtaposition should have been jarring, but instead felt exactly right. Two traditions braided together, just like Charvalita herself. Byron asked me to speak at both services. At the temple, I delivered a eulogy in Korean about chosen family, about two women who'd found each other across oceans and language barriers and built something stronger than blood, about the courage it took to love people fully when loss was always waiting, and about how Charvalita had taught me that being seen was worth the risk of being hurt. My voice shook but didn't break. I spoke about my mother too, about Youngmi's son, who Charvalita had saved, who'd spent her life running but never forgot her friend. I told the assembled mourners that Charvalita hadn't just saved my mother once, she'd saved her daughter 20 years later by refusing to let another generation live invisible. At the church, I spoke in English, shorter and simpler, about grace and sacrifice and the complicated mathematics of love. But the Korean eulogy was the one that mattered, the one I saw Byron crying through, the one his associates recorded on their phones like it was something precious. And that's when I understood. I wasn't just being recognized as Byron's girlfriend or his mother's companion. I was being formally acknowledged as his partner in front of everyone who mattered in his world. The men and women who'd attended both services, who'd brought flowers and food and whispered condolences in multiple languages, they were seeing me, really seeing me, and accepting me as part of Byron's life in a way that felt irrevocable. Marcus told me later that what I'd done was rare, that Byron's world didn't easily accept outsiders, especially not young women without family or connections or power. But I'd loved Charvalita authentically, had spoken at her funeral with genuine grief, had stood beside Byron through the worst moment of his life without flinching. That bought credibility money couldn't purchase. 2 months later, when the sharpest edges of grief had dulled into something manageable, Byron took me back to Myeongdong Grill. We sat at the same table where we'd negotiated our terms, where I'd first demanded to be treated as an equal. The Ajumma brought banchan and smiled at us like she knew secrets we hadn't figured out yet. Byron waited until we'd finished eating, until the restaurant was nearly empty, until I was relaxed and laughing at some story about Marcus accidentally insulting a diplomat in Mandarin. Then he took my hand and produced a small velvet box from his jacket. I promised we'd do this right, he said. Dating. Building something real. Getting to know each other outside of obligation and grief. I think 2 months of actual dating plus 2 months of complicated mourning counts as sufficient time to know that I can't imagine my life without you in it. He opened the box to reveal a ring, not a diamond, but a deep green jade set in platinum, flanked by small diamonds that caught the light. Traditional and modern at once, Korean and American, exactly like us. Marry me, he said. Not because of my mother's memory, not because of our deal or your debts or any of the reasons I first brought you into my life. Marry me because you love me, because I love you, because we're building something that's ours, not haunted by the past or coerced by circumstances, just ours. I looked at the ring, at his face, at the life we'd accidentally constructed from grief and secrets, and 2 mothers who'd loved each other across impossible distances. Yes, I said. Yes, absolutely yes. We married 6 weeks later in a ceremony so small it felt like a secret we were keeping from the world. Just Marcus and Dante as witnesses, a judge who owed Byron a favor, and a handful of close friends who understood that some things were too precious for spectacle. I wore a dress that blended hanbok silhouette with modern design silk, the color of sunset, embroidered with cranes and cherry blossoms, traditional but unmistakably mine. Byron wore a dark suit with a vest that incorporated traditional Korean buttons, his tattoos visible at his wrists and neck, marking him as the complicated man he was. When the judge pronounced us married, and Byron kissed me, I thought about my mother and Charvalita watching from somewhere beyond, probably laughing at how their complicated friendship had resulted in this, their children bound together by choice rather than blood. That night, standing in Byron's penthouse, our penthouse now looking out over the city lights, I thought about the terrified waitress who'd accidentally spoken Korean to a dangerous man's mother. That girl would have run, would have taken the money and disappeared, choosing safety over connection, invisibility over risk. But I wasn't her anymore. I was Sean Maloney, wife to a man who'd offered me freedom and celebrated when I chose him instead. Partner in a life I was building with my own hands rather than accepting whatever scraps the world offered, seen, known, chosen, and choosing back with everything I had. My mother had died invisible, but her daughter was done hiding. Whatever came next, I'd face it standing in the light. 1 year later, I stood in the nursery of our penthouse watching the sun set over the city, my hand resting on the curve of my belly where our daughter grew. Me son Charvalita Maloney, a name that carried the weight of two women who'd loved each other across impossible distances, who'd saved each other in different ways, who'd shaped the woman I'd become without ever knowing they were doing it. The room was painted a soft sage green, decorated with a careful blend of modern Scandinavian design and Korean traditional elements. A Hanji lamp cast warm light across silk cushions embroidered with cranes. Shelves held Korean children's books alongside English ones. A mobile of origami butterflies drifted in the air conditioning's gentle current. It was a room for a child who would grow up belonging to multiple worlds, who would never have to choose between the different parts of herself the way my mother had, the way I'd tried to. The past year had transformed me in ways I was still discovering. Byron had meant it when he'd called me his partner, not as a polite fiction, but as an actual role in his business. My cultural fluency, the Korean language skills I'd tried so hard to bury, had become invaluable as he'd worked to legitimize his operations. I'd accompanied him to meetings with Korean importers, had translated not just words but cultural nuances that made the difference between deals closing and falling apart. But more than that, I'd brought something to his world that reputation and fear couldn't build. Genuine relationships. I negotiated with kindness rather than intimidation, built loyalty through respect rather than coercion. The other wives and partners in Byron's circle, women who'd initially terrified me with their sharp edges and calculating eyes, had slowly become something like friends once they realized I wasn't competing, wasn't trying to climb any hierarchy, was just trying to build something sustainable. Marcus's wife had taught me which battles to fight and which to let Byron win. Dante's husband had shown me how to navigate the unspoken rules of Byron's world without losing myself. And slowly, carefully, I'd helped Byron see that the theatrical violence, the reputation for ruthlessness, could be replaced with something more powerful, being someone people wanted to work with rather than someone they feared. The Seoul deal was the culmination of everything we'd built. A massive contract with 3 major Korean corporations that would move 95% of Byron's business into completely legitimate territory. Import-export of luxury goods, electronics, textiles, all legal, all clean, all sustainable. The remaining 5%, the reputation management, the protection of the people Byron cared about, would fade into the background, a relic of his father's world rather than his own. He was flying out tomorrow to finalize everything. 2 weeks in Seoul, meeting with executives and government officials, securing the partnerships that would define the next decade of his business. Our business, really. My name was on the contracts too, my signature carrying weight I'd never imagined possible. I heard him before I saw him, his footsteps quiet on the hardwood floor. Then his arms wrapped around me from behind, his tattooed hands, scarred knuckles, and all settling gently on my belly where our daughter kicked with increasing frequency. She was active tonight, like she knew something important was happening, like she wanted to be part of the conversation. "You're supposed to be resting," Byron murmured against my hair. "Doctor's orders. I'm standing, not running a marathon." I leaned back into his warmth, into the solid reality of him. "Besides, she won't let me rest. Your daughter has opinions about sleep schedules." "My daughter?" I felt him smile. "Pretty sure she gets her stubbornness from you." We stood there in the golden evening light, watching the city below begin its transformation into night. From up here, it looked almost peaceful, the chaos and struggle and survival happening on the streets invisible from this height. I thought about the waitress I'd been, the studio apartment with cardboard in her shoes, the constant calculation of whether she could afford both electricity and food. That girl felt like a character in a story I'd read rather than the person I'd been. "Are you worried about the trip?" I asked. "No." His hands moved in slow circles over my belly, soothing the daughter who would carry his mother's name and my mother's name, who would grow up belonging to both their legacies. "Everything's arranged. The contracts are solid. Your translations were flawless. This is just formality at this point." "Then why are you tense?" He was quiet for a moment, and I felt him kiss the top of my head. "Because I'm leaving you. Because I've never been away from you for more than 2 days since we got married. Because I'm going to miss feeling her kick and seeing you arrange her room for the 100th time and arguing about whether we're reading too many parenting books." I turned in his arms, looking up at his face, still dangerous, still sharp-edged, but softer now when he looked at me, vulnerable in ways he'd probably never been with anyone before. "We'll be here when you get back, both of us. And you'll call every day, probably twice a day, and Marcus is only going to let me do approved activities. Marcus has strict orders. Byron confirmed. No lifting anything heavy, no stress, no living my life? I interrupted, but I was smiling. His overprotectiveness was annoying and endearing in equal measure. I almost lost you once, he said quietly, and I knew he was thinking about the early pregnancy complications, the week I'd spent on bed rest, the terror in his eyes when the doctor had listed all the things that could go wrong. I'm not risking it again. You're not going to lose me. I took his scarred hands in mine, brought them to my lips. I'm not my mother. I'm not running. I'm not hiding. I'm standing right here, visible and loud, and taking up all the space I want. You taught me that. You taught yourself, he corrected. I just gave you permission to be what you already were. I thought about that scared girl in the greasy diner, the one who'd made herself small and forgettable, who'd believed invisibility was the same as safety. I thought about my mother, Jung-mi-sun, who'd run from Kim Tae-sung and spent 20 years looking over her shoulder, who'd died without ever feeling truly safe. I thought about Charvalita, who'd chosen danger over comfort, who'd left her country and her family to save the people she loved, who'd built a life that honored all the complicated pieces of who she was. No regrets? Byron asked softly, and I recognized the question for what it was, not just about him leaving, but about everything, about the choice I'd made to tear up the freedom he'd offered and choose this instead, this dangerous, visible, complicated life where I was someone's partner and soon someone's mother, where my name meant something in rooms I'd never have been allowed to enter before. Hueopso, I answered in Korean, the language my mother had taught me, the language that had brought me to this moment. Damando irjik marajanan gotman huehe. No regrets, only that I didn't speak up sooner. Byron pulled me closer, careful of my belly, and kissed me like he was trying to memorize the moment. Around us, the nursery glowed golden in the last light of day. Below us, the city moved through its endless rhythm. And inside me, our daughter Mi-sun Charvalita, legacy of two women who'd loved fiercely and paid dearly for it, kicked against her father's hand like she was reminding us she was here, she was real, she was the future we'd built from broken pieces. My mother had chosen invisibility and found only death. I'd chosen visibility, with all its dangers and demands, and found life, found love, found family, found home. We stood there together in the golden light, no longer hiding, no longer afraid, finally, impossibly, completely home. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.